First of all, thank you for joining us, Lee. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Great to be here. Thanks, Martin.
So in terms of introductions, let me just share my screen. I've got a Deckhive session ready to share, just to kind of share a bit about you and what you do, which I have to say is a bit impressive. There's lots of things to highlight really about the things that you've done. I've obviously seen you speaking at various positive psychology conferences around the world over the last, well, 10 or 12 years maybe, I have to admit I didn't realize all the things that you've managed to achieve in the kind of 25 plus years that you've been a psychologist and a researcher and an author and a speaker and all these amazing things. But to see some of these highlights about where your work's been featured, being one of the top 100 women of influence in Australia and recently receiving the Order of Australia. Are there any of these kind of things that really kind of stand out to you as kind of as something you're most proud of in all the things that you've been doing over your career?
That's a nice question. Definitely the book, my parenting book. That's a real, I do feel really, really proud of that. I'm glad that I did it. I remember when I got the book deal signed with Penguin in the US, and I was like super duper excited, but also completely naive, because I told them it would only take me a year to write that book. And it took me 2.5 years because, I wrote a book about parenting, the science, the positive psychology behind sort of positive parenting, whilst I was full-time researcher at the university in positive psychology and a full-time parent. So everything takes more than dolly as long as you expect. And so that I'm really proud of. And the fact that it's been translated into 10 languages. And it's always a thrill for me when I get messages on social media from people all across the world saying, I just read your book and it's really improved my relationship with my teenage son or daughter, or my husband and I are now on the same page, or my partner and I are now on the same page. So that's definitely one that stands out. Obviously, receiving the Order of Australia last year was very humbling. And I still can't quite believe that one, but that's something I'm very proud of, particularly for my children, just to show them that, if you sort of be a good person and put effort in over a sustained period of time, that you can end up doing good. And the biggest thing that I'm proud of, Martin, is not on this list.
Oh,
and and that's being a mum, mother of 2 children, 2 teenage kids now, 18 and 14. Nicholas, my son, is 18, and Emily, my daughter, is 14. So that's probably the thing that I'm the most proud of, to be honest.
That's important, isn't it? Keep that balance of the personal and the professional. And I guess when your professional work kind of is so focused on families and children and how to bring the best out of kids, I guess that kind of must present some interesting challenges, because I know that Michelle, my business partner, often says, how often her kids roll their eyes. It's like, oh yeah, you're trying to psychologize me again, Mum.
Yes. Yeah, I've heard that sentence many, many times. It can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on the day and depending on the child. So yeah.
Now I've just been pulling across a few of the cards. We'll talk about the cards in a bit more detail a bit later on, but these kind of things were striking me in your introduction, and having seen you speak before about some of your strengths. Clearly, you talked about the perseverance or the length of time it took you to do your book. So perseverance, clearly was needed there. You've certainly taken leadership with your presidency of the International Positive Psychology Association for a couple of years, which I know you did amazing work in that time, and that's a huge role to take on. And you've been brave to kind of champion this whole area of positive psychology in respect to parenting. So I remember you saying many years ago about the conversation with Martin Seligman, where he kind of laid down the gauntlet, really, didn't he, to say this is the area to kind of, you can be the person that kind of lead this kind of field.
That's true. And you have a very good memory. Yeah, that was an interesting conversation with Professor Martin Seligman at his home in Pennsylvania, and me sort of saying, this is 15 or so years ago, it was a reasonably new field, the field of positive psychology. And I was asking, I was doing a lot, and still to this day do a lot of work in schools, and seeing the impact of introducing these positive psychology practices to young people in a school environment. And of course, back then, my kids were very young. And so just kind of asked him, who's doing this research with the parents? Because we need to have both home and school reinforcing these messages and helping kind of bring out the strengths in young kids. And yeah, he said, no one's doing that. You should do that. And I was sort of like, gulp. I'm not sure if that's really in my wheelhouse. So that's nice that you see that as brave. I think, it probably was, in hindsight, a brave thing to do, to sort of map out some new territory. But there was such purpose behind it,
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, I mean, what more important way can there be of making this stuff kind of make a difference, really? I mean, we often focus on workplaces, and I know you do that too. And that's really important. But, when it comes back to the basics of helping children develop into their best selves from a young age, that, and to deal with the challenges that they have to face, especially, these days, there can't be any greater purpose, I'm sure, than that. So that must give you a lot of satisfaction to feel like you're contributing in that area.
It does. Yeah, it does give me a really nice sense of satisfaction. And thank you for the cards. That's a really nice little strength spotting exercise you and I have just done to see you reflecting back to me bravery and leadership and zest and a sense of hope. And certainly that sort of perseverance to keep going, and social intelligence. That's nice that you see that.
Fab. Well, we'll talk about the cards a bit more in a moment, but I'll stop sharing screens for a moment, because I think it'd be just a wasted opportunity to be talking to you and not really get an insight about kind of what does the research say in this area, and why, why is it so important that people who are working with children, whether they be parents or psychologists, social workers, teachers, many of the different kind of roles that work with teachers, why is strengths so valuable and important, and why would you recommend that people kind of pay attention to this as a subject area?
Such an important question. And it's sort of, I guess it picks up a little bit on what you were saying before, that a lot of the sort of positive psychology science and practice has been directed more to adults and adult development, and helping us as adults have good mental health and reach our full potential and, feel satisfied at work. And my PhD was actually in organizational psychology. So the first 10 years of my life was very much in that sort of corporate world and professional learning, professional development, professional training with adults. And this was really at the time where positive psychology was a very new field of science. And so I was doing that with typically, kind of very senior executives, C-suite executives, and they were all getting so much benefit from learning about their strengths, learning how to utilize their strengths, learning how to make the most of their strengths in a workplace situation and in their life more generally. And time again, working with those very senior executives, they would say to me, this has been transformative. Why haven't I learned about this earlier? And that was such it was just this repeated question. And so I thought, well, that's actually a really good question. And initially, because my PhD was in organizational psychology and I was working more in the corporate world, I was starting to think, well, we need to design early career orientation programs that are strength-based to help people sort of like launch them into their career from a strength-based perspective to begin with, to help with burnout and all of the issues that we have in the workplace. And but at that time, my son Nicholas, who I mentioned before, is 18 now. He's in his final year of school and he's over 6 foot, so I have to sort of look up at him to tell him off. He was 4 and 3 or 4, I think it was 3, just started 3-year-old kindergarten. Anyway, I was preparing a workshop for an investment banking firm, and he came in and said, "What are you doing, Mum?" And he sat up on my knee, and I said, "Well, I'm teaching these people about their strengths." And because of course he was 3, almost 4, but that had been his whole life, just me always talking to him about, oh, that's great kindness, and you really use fairness there, and we need a little bit more perseverance, and I know the bath is a bit cold, but just use your bravery, you can get in. And so he just sat on my knee and he was like, oh, so you mean such and such and such and such. And I watched this little human being have such literacy around his strengths. And so it was one of those sort of light bulb moments for me where I thought, well, why work with people who are 44 when I can work with kids when they're 4? And then I won't keep getting this question from these senior executives, why haven't I learned about this before? So that kind of really took me into developmental psychology and educational psychology, and there's my own research included, but decades of research now in this sort of broader field that's called prevention science, prevention psychology, or strength-based science. And really all of that research shows that the younger the age where we introduce these young children to emotional literacy, social emotional skills, their own strengths, that sets up a positive trajectory in terms of their mental health. And do you want me to talk about some of the research findings? Or
yeah, please. Yeah, it'd be good just to kind of get a sense of what does that look like? What's the evidence for it?
Yeah, okay. So I sort of categorize the evidence into 3 broad buckets, the 3 S's: schools, self, and social. And so what the research shows is that when students are connected with their strengths, when they understand their own unique constellation of strengths, be it creativity or leadership or teamwork or wisdom and perspective or social intelligence or humor, when they're connected up with their own unique strengths, they do better academically because they know who they are. That helps inform their subject choices, and it helps them to capitalize or utilize their strengths to have effective study habits. So they do better academically. The research also shows that they transition through various school levels more smoothly. So, if you think about the big transitions in a young person's life from a school-based perspective, so transitioning from kinder into sort of primary or elementary school, and then the transition from primary school to middle school, research showing that kids who utilize their strengths have more success in that transition, and also that they feel a greater sense of belonging to school and a greater sense of satisfaction at school. And you can understand that if you think about a strength. So a strength is a positive quality that comes naturally to you. It's something that you do well. So strengths are the things that we're good at. We have fast learning curve when we're utilizing our strengths. Will typically be a little bit above what would be an age appropriate expectation. So, you think of kids that you would know, Martin, and your friends' kids. You've got that little kid who's just sort of like wise beyond their years, and we don't understand how they can be so wise. Or the kid who's just has this exceptional like comedic timing, or just this really strong sense of compassion and social intelligence. And so that's what we know about strengths, is that they're things that come naturally to you, that you're good at, you sort of you learn quickly, you perform well. They're also, what we also know about strengths is that strengths are energizing. So when you are in a situation where you get to use your strengths, so clearly with you, you've got strengths of creativity and strengths of curiosity and a range of other strengths to like put together all the different things you have with your, not just Deckhive, but all of the other things that you do. So when we are using our strengths, they're energizing. And we come out at the end of that experience feeling quite energized and upbeat. So that makes sense if you think about that, and then you think about the research saying that kids who know and use their strengths at school are more engaged at school, they're more satisfied with school, they feel this greater sense of belonging. And so that's the first bucket, that's the S bucket of school. Then you've got the second bucket, which is self. And so 2 decades of research showing that when young people start to learn their strengths and utilize their strengths in a day-to-day basis, high levels of confidence, high levels of life satisfaction, high levels of hope, high levels of optimism, pretty much, you name it, anything that you would, if you're a teacher, if you're a school psychologist, social worker, counselor, parent, all the things that we want those capacities that we want to develop in our young children stand a much better chance when we connect our students, our clients, our patients, our sons and daughters up with their strengths. So that's the kind of self bucket. And then the third bucket, the third S bucket is what I call social. And what I love about working with strengths with young people is that the research shows, and I've seen this time and time again, is that strengths make us more pro-social. And what I mean by that is that, you know, when a young person knows their own sort of constellation of strengths, because it gives them that sense of inner confidence and that sense of inner energy, and they know what their own anchor point is, a couple of things happen. The first is they start to get better at spotting strengths in other people, in their friends, in their teachers, in their parents, in their relatives, because they've got strengths literacy, and they understand that, well, if I have strengths, other people have strengths. So they become more pro-social in that regard. But what the research also shows is that schools in particular, when schools bring in a strength-based approach, then the metrics show young kids are kinder, they're more compassionate, they're more altruistic, they resolve conflict more constructively. So yeah, I could go on and on, but really it's those the three kind of S's: benefits at school, the self benefits, and then the social benefits that come about as a result of helping a young person to see and own who they are at their best. Now, that doesn't mean that we ignore weaknesses, ignore problem behavior, ignore challenges. No, we don't. A strength-based approach is not an either or. So it's not about saying I'll only focus on the strengths of this young person at the you know, and I'll ignore everything else. It's not an either or, it's a both and. But what it is it's highlighting this, it's looking for strengths first. It's looking for what is right in this young person first. Because when we know that, we can use that often to take back and platform off their strengths, their talents, their qualities, their fast learning curves, their interests, use those as the sort of foundation basis to go back and address some of the challenges and problem behavior.
Yeah, so it's a kind of different mindset, really, isn't it? Leading with strengths in that way. And I can see the emotional impact that has on the child if they think that's what we notice first.
Yes. And here's the sort of counterintuitive that I found, which was that the more strength-based you are as a parent or teacher or educator, the more weakness-focused you can also be. And it sounds like a counterintuitive, like, well, how does that occur? But it's exactly what you just said, Martin. So when a young person knows that you see first and foremost what is good about them, what is right about them, their strengths, their talents, their assets, their unique little quirks, you actually have, because that creates a bond and a sense of psychological safety, you then actually can have those conversations about weaknesses, challenging behaviors, problem areas, and you met with less defensiveness. So the more strength-based you become, the more weakness-oriented you actually can be.
And do you think that goes across all kind of roles, all the different kind of key, trying to think of a better word, stakeholders isn't really the right word, is it, in this kind of context, but all the different people who have contact with a child, does the same thing apply to all of those relationships?
Yeah, I would say so. I can tell you what the research says. So my research has been done primarily with parents and teachers, and certainly in both of those types of adults in the young person's life, that is the case. There's lots of research done in psychology and social work looking at what happens when therapists take a strength-based approach with young people, so that, that's another sort of stakeholder, if you want to say, in the young person's life. If you step away from strengths and just look at sort of developmental psychology more generally, the research shows that the more consistent the messages are from all the different adults in the young person's life, the more likely that the young person is to internalize those messages. And that cuts both ways, of course, because if you have a young person who, is in an abusive situation, has abusive or neglectful parents, then acts out at school and gets told at school that you're no good, you're naughty, then gets put into some sort of case management system where they don't have a strength-based case managed worker, then they're getting the opposite sort of consistent message. So I think what's sort of sitting underneath your question is like, well, I'm just assuming, or maybe I'm fantasizing, maybe it's that hope card you put up before. Like, wouldn't it be amazing if all of the adults who work with young people, whether it's the sports coach, the parent, the religious minister, the extended family member, the teacher, the integration aide, the support staff, the social worker, wouldn't it be amazing if they all had this same strengths approach and this same strengths literacy? And so they're consistently giving that cohesive message to the young person, which does make them feel good about themselves, but also importantly builds up their resilience, so that when it's not just about, I don't know if this is an expression you use over there, but in Australia we talk about blowing hot air into someone. So sort of filling them up with nothing. That's not what a strength-based approach is. It's about connecting them with what is true and real in them. And so that when they do come up against life's challenges and life's adversities, they've got this kind of internal anchor point that they can kind of like go inwards and draw upon. And I've actually just submitted a paper for publication, so psychology study, where we looked at the role of strength-based parenting during COVID with teenagers. Yeah. And what we found is that the teenagers who said my mum and dad, or my mum and mum, or dad and dad, my parents helped me they reminded me of like my strengths during this time. They had much better mental health. So it's not just for the good times. Yes.
And I know you said before about the strengths-based approach is both useful at the sort of remedial end and the therapeutic end, and also on the more constructive and I can't remember what the word you used was a more positively focused
promotion.
Health promotion.
True. You sort of got the mental health continuum of like the treatment end, where a young person has been diagnosed, is struggling, is at risk, and so that's more of that therapeutic end, working with psychologists, social workers, counselors, and so on. And a strength-based approach really so important and effective at that end. But then you also got the other end of the mental health continuum, just to the everyday kid who's not struggling. But when we connect that everyday kid with their internal qualities and the things that are good about them, that really sort of, they go from good to great. It really maximizes their sense of self and their potential as well.
I don't know if it's the case in Australia so much as it is here, but I think there's often a challenge that the educational system as a whole is sometimes too focused, I think, on the restorative, the deficit focus and getting kids to kind of be good enough. And what I like about what you're saying there is it allows kind of kids who might otherwise be overlooked because they're doing fine. It allows them to kind of kick on to become the best that they can be as well, which is really important.
Yeah, it's basically nudging everyone up along the kind of mental health continuum, wherever they happen to be. And certainly in my book, I've got lots of stories of just sort of the everyday kids and what happens when their parents adopt that strength-based approach, but also some really powerful stories of some associations that I've worked with children in foster care system, who just have sad, tragic stories, who've just been told that they're defective and unwanted in so many ways by so many people. And just the turning point when you have an adult in their life who's able to say, you actually, I love your humor. Your humor is really good. Sometimes you overuse it and it gets you into trouble, but for me, that's such a good quality of who you are. Or your sense of fairness and justice, like that's such an asset in you, and just the difference it makes to a young person's life.
Yeah, and it would be lovely to get to that point where the majority of people in a child's life reinforce a strengths-based approach, but there are so many examples, aren't there, where someone has faced that adversity and yet there's one person who's had that belief in them and they've reinforced those qualities, and that's made all the difference. So we need to remember that even if our contact with a child is maybe quite small in the grand scheme of things, it can be really important.
Yeah, it's so important. And, you know, that was the case in my own journey too, growing up in an abusive household and really struggling, but having one or two teachers who just probably weren't called strength-based teachers back in the 70s and 80s, but they had the capacity to connect me up with some qualities in me that I didn't see, and really convinced me that, oh, you know, you're quite intelligent, you're quite studious, you know, you should pursue university studies. And like, you know, they were the teachers. They played such a big role in what I'm doing today. And all of the little sticky notes that you had at the start, it came from those two teachers and a grandmother, who really helped me during a very hard time.
Yeah. It's nice to have that kind of grounding and be able to connect when you're dealing with many people who are dealing with lots of challenges of their own. So why cards then? I know you've got 2 decks of cards that we have in Deckhive, and we'll show those shortly. So I have them here. So we've got your Strength Stars cards. We have the Strengths for Kids and Teens. So why did you create these? What role can these play in this kind of bigger picture that you were just describing, that we might want to aspire to achieve in terms of our work with children?
Here's the thing. The research is so compelling. We've got 3 decades of research explaining the why and the what, you know, why we should take a strength-based approach and what happens when we do. And the missing piece to me is the how, like the actual just concrete everyday tools that I can use as a parent, that a psychologist can use, a social worker can use, an integration a worker can use one-on-one, or that a teacher can use with a whole class. And that's the most beautiful thing, is when you see teachers using these very concrete tools with their class, and how the students start to internalize their own strengths. But like I mentioned earlier, they get that strengths literacy. So they start to see strengths in each other, and they start to understand. I actually had a message on Messenger the other day from a teacher in an Australian school that I work with a couple of years ago. It's a school up in Queensland. And the teacher sent me this most gorgeous message on Messenger just to say, I just thought you should know. And so she said she teaches an all boys school, and it's a year 5, and they've got quiet time because they're working on a project. And she said she had deliberately paired sort of 2 boys to sit together on the one table, one who is more studious and the other who gets distracted very easily. And so they're all supposed to be quiet, and the boy who's getting distracted is getting distracted, and he's starting to distract others. And she was about to stand up and sort of go into teacher mode, and the more studious boy whispered across and said, are you using your strength of fairness right now? And she just said, this works. You know, these boys have internalized this language. And so the peer turns and says, come on, you know, you're not being fair. And the other boy sort of stops and thinks, oh yeah, I better be a little bit more quiet. So it's beautiful to see what happens when you take it into a classroom, and how the young kids internalize it. And you can use it in all sorts of ways in classrooms, and we can talk about that a little bit later, but you can use it as a learning tool. You can use it as a behavior management tool. I've seen teachers priming their students, particularly secondary school students. All right, we're about to go on a school excursion, and we're about to get on a bus. We're about to go here. Like, what are the top 5 strengths we're going to need today to sort of enjoy ourselves, keep ordered, follow the rules? So there's so many ways that you can use it. And the cards were really about the how. How do we make this concrete? How do we turn it into a tool that parents, teachers, psychologists, etc. can use? And why I like the cards is because they're very visual. And I'm a visual learner. But secondly, I think it's a really useful way for kids to learn, teenagers to learn, but particularly the young kids. And, you know, because my passion is to sort of, is that early intervention approach. And so the cards that you've got up on the screen, Martin, they're the Strength Stars cards. And this is a pack for kids from the age of 3 to 8. Very visual for the kids. And so, and you know, it's helping the children to develop their sort of digital literacy and their emotional literacy and their strength literacy, but in a fun, sort of concrete, practical way. So yeah, look, what I did was I worked with a graphic designer, came up with the idea of of stars, and decided this pack and the other pack, Strengths for Kids and Teens, are both based on an evidence-based model called the VIA model. And you're nodding because you know that model very well. So that's been a model that's been around. It was developed by a team of psychology researchers in the US. It's been around for 2 decades. It's been validated in 52 different countries. Like it's a really, really strong, rigorous, evidence-based, science-driven model. And that model says that there are 24 different character strengths. And so I worked with a graphic designer to find a star, to develop a star for each of those 24 character strengths. And the other thing that I did was I worked with a bunch of kindergarten kids, with 2 of my collaborators, Kirsty Hale, who is a kindergarten teacher, and Claire Fortune, who works with me. Claire has a master's degree in positive psychology. And so we actually went out and asked the kindergarten kids, tell us what you think each of these character strengths are. So tell us what you think love of learning is. And so what you see in the little white box, I love learning new things, and I make lots of opportunities, and I like discovering new topics. They're actually the words from the young kids themselves. So we really tried to make this very accessible for young kids. And each of the stars has been designed to sort of visually represent the character strength. So for example, if you see forgiveness, if you want to zoom on forgiveness, Martin.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, so I give people a second chance, and we can put our problems behind us, and I forgive people. But if you flick it around to the other side, the facial expression on the stars. So that one, I had to go back and forward with the graphic designer a number of times to get the right angle of the eyes and the right angle of the cheeks and the right angle of the eyebrows. And you can see that, one of the stars has this look of remorse on, I'm sorry that I did this. And then you see the other one shaking his hand with a smile and saying, that's okay. And so that was actually a really, really fun project to go through 24 different character strengths and visualize them through stars. And look, the reason that I chose stars is because little kids know stars. You look up in the sky and you see the stars, and stars are the things that shine bright and light the pathway forward for you. And you get a gold star if you're doing well. And so I wanted to make it really, really tangible and concrete. And because I'm using my strength, hey, you're being a star. You're using your strength of curiosity, or you're using your strength of patience, or you're using your strength of kindness. And so it was really, really fun to design that. And that it is, as far as I know, actually the only set of strengths cards that are around for kids that young.
Yeah, I was going to say there really aren't very many. I haven't seen any others. I imagine I probably would have done if there had been. So yeah.
Yes, you have. Of all people, you have.
But given it's such an important age to start those conversations, then this is an ideal tool, because I know that teachers use cards for all sorts of things, don't they, to kind of engage kids and make things interactive and to help reinforce key points. So to have something that's kind of so important in that area as a practical tool, I think is fantastic. And one of the great things about cards is they're so versatile, aren't they? Because you can use them in so many different ways. So what are some of the ways that you've either used them yourself or you've heard of other people using them with kids that kind of really work well?
Yeah, so many different ways, but I think I want to sort of highlight that you can definitely use these cards to help young children identify their particular strengths. So, forgiveness comes easily to me, or, I have a lot of zest, or I do have perspective. So that direct and explicit social and emotional learning component. But this is why I love working with teachers, because I develop the tool and then they go and use it in all of these different ways that I hadn't imagined. And so what I've really seen is that, yes, it's used for that sort of social and emotional learning and development, but that teachers are also just using it as a curriculum learning tool. And so one of the great things I've seen is, particularly with these younger cards, is teachers using it with story time. And I think we've got a table set up for that one, Martin. So one of the schools I visited, the teacher had story time, And so she had up the story she was reading. I've just sort of grabbed one of my favorite children's storybooks here, which is called The Sneetches. It's a Dr. Seuss book. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the story, it's a Dr. Seuss story where there's sort of this group of people, and some of them get to have a certain patch on their stomach. It's a star, and so they think that that makes them better than the people who don't. Sort of like blue eye, brown eye sort of controversy. And there's a sort of money making character who comes in and takes advantage of it all. But eventually the whole tribe of Sneetches wake up and realize it doesn't really matter who has a star on their belly and who doesn't. Like, we're all the same. We need to cooperate. And so this can be used as a learning tool. You're sitting in circle time, you're reading a story, and the strengths cards is a really lovely way of adding that extra layer of helping the kids analyze the story and think about, well, what are the character strengths that we see in the book characters? What's the kind of moral of the story? And so as you're reading the story, you can have kids on their devices pulling in, oh, that character showed kindness, that character showed judgment, forgiveness, honesty, and so on. And you can have this really much richer conversation about the story and the characters and the moral of the story. So then the cards actually become a learning tool for curriculum and enhanced vocabulary.
Yeah, that's really nice. I think it's really nice when you can just integrate these kind of approaches to things that are being done anyway, because there's always pressure on the time, isn't there, for teachers to add something else. And so I know there's always this kind of fear of, well, yes, I know it's important, but what do I have to drop in order to fit this in? So if you can just embed it within something you're doing anyway, then that seems to be.
I love that point, and it's so true. There's always a crowded curriculum, and teachers are under so much pressure. So the beauty of this is that it's a practical tool. You can apply it in lots of different ways. It's complementing what you need to do, and you don't sort of have to find room in the timetable. You know, Thursdays on period 5, that's when we'll teach strengths. It's a philosophy and an approach that underpins everything. Yeah.
And yet we can have activities which are more focused on the strengths of the students themselves in the classroom. So I know you have a few other different ideas about how you do that as well that work very well.
And I've seen it used in a range of different ways. I've seen it used as a sort of conflict resolution tool where you bring the two kids together, or the group if it happens to be that case, and get them to get on the Deckhive and have a conversation around, okay, well, what strengths were missing in this conversation? What did you forget to use that led to the conflict? And it's less confronting for a young child if you're all sort of on your devices and you start to bring across, well, I forgot to use fairness and I forgot to use teamwork and I probably should have used a bit more kindness. And then all of a sudden they're team problem solving what happened, and they're doing it through the device. And then what happens over time is it starts off with the device, but then they start looking up at each other and having this conversation. And so they come up with their own solution. It's not shaming them and punishing them. They come up with the solution that, you know, next time round, we need to use more kindness or a little bit more patience or a bit more fairness. And so that's a really, really effective way of using these cards. And I've seen that done with the hard copy cards, but I can imagine it would be really, really effective. In fact, almost more effective on the devices, because at the start of the conversation, it's less confronting when you're sort of interacting with others, but through the device.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a bit like when people are doing coaching and they're kind of going for a walk or something, is just not having the eyeball situation. It kind of just changes the dynamic in a really helpful way sometimes.
Yeah, so wise to draw that analogy. And it's exactly true. Like it's not sort of, it's parallel play almost, you know, and you're walking side by side. So that's a really effective way of using it. And another fantastic way that I've seen teachers use it, which I think you're going to click onto table 3 for us now, is to generate a birthday card for students in your class. And so this is, you set up the table and you put your little note, happy birthday, Anna, on the inside, and then the students themselves draw in the cards. And so you can see in this example that lots of students saw kindness in Anna. 3 students have nominated kindness in Anna, and other students have seen forgiveness in her, and social intelligence and honesty and bravery and hope and love of learning. And so it's a lovely way for and fairly quick way for everyone to come together, this can take 5 minutes. Everyone gets on, each of the students, they draw across a card. For the older students, for the littlies, the kind of 3 to 5, they probably just draw the card across. But for the 6, 7, 8, where we're starting to develop their digital skills and their written skills and their literacy skills, they can pull across a little sticky note, and they can write a little message to Anna to say happy birthday, or I hope you enjoy your cake, or can't wait for your party. So you can add layers to this. And the lovely thing about this is that you can copy it, you can download it. You've got a copy of it afterwards. So print it out on your color photocopy, and it goes home with this most gorgeous birthday messages and birthday card. There's so many ways you can use it. And particularly, I mean, I want to say this, you can use it in the class. More and more schools now, in the class on campus, I should say. So more and more schools are moving towards device-based technologies, technology-oriented schools. So this can happen on campus, but for so many of us right now in global pandemic, right now I have both of my children learning from home because we're in hard lockdown in Melbourne. So I'm having to use all of my strengths as a parent. But I mean, what a lovely way if you've got a student who it's her birthday or his birthday and they're in remote learning because of a global pandemic and they can't get to see their friends. What a lovely thing to organise. As a teacher, each of those students can do it from their own home, and she can take a screenshot and send it off as a PDF in an email to her student. And then, that student gets this beautiful sense of feeling connected with his or her classmates, even though they can't learn together at that moment in time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's made even easier by the fact we've just added this camera icon here, which takes a screenshot. So that was just added yesterday, in fact.
So cool. That is a good.
Makes it even easier.
Great. Yes. Great.
Well, so
and
okay.
I'm actually sorry, Martin. I'm just going to let you know that I mentioned we're in lockdown in Melbourne at the moment, and I have 2 nieces who they both happen to be born on the same day, which is next week. And one's about to turn 15 and one's about to turn 6. So I'm going to coordinate with the 4 family houses across Melbourne to create this birthday card for each of my nieces and do it via Zoom and have a little party, and so that they feel sort of loved and supported by their family, even though we can't see them in person. So you don't just have to use it as a teacher. I'm using it as an auntie.
Yeah, that's lovely, isn't it? Because it's the conversations that it prompts. Yes. I think are really, really valuable. And as with lots of the positive psychology based approaches, it's the questions that we ask, isn't it? The process of going through that inquiry of thinking about what is it that I love about Charlotte.
Yes.
And that kind of like just having to think about it kind of, even if you don't even tell her, which of course would be a missed opportunity, but even if you didn't, it changes the dynamic of that relationship, doesn't it? And how you feel yourself as an observer of her and the way you interact with her in the future. So they're simple but very, very powerful changes that we can make.
Yes, I agree.
Now I'm going to close the Strength Stars cards now. Is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
Because I want to open up the other deck that you have in Deckhive, which is designed for working with older kids. So why have you done something different for these guys?
Just developmentally, we, sort of around the age of 8, there's a pretty big growth in our frontal lobe, which means that from the age of 9 onwards, we can start to have a greater perspective. It's called theory of mind. So we can start to have a greater perspective of what's happening inside another person's mind. If you think back to your 2 boys, Martin, when they were younger, they don't really have an understanding. They just think everyone thinks what I'm thinking and feeling in this moment. And so developmentally, we know around the age of 9, and then of course through the teen. So this card is set up for kids and teens, sort of 9 to 19, or certainly you can use it for older, early adults if you're in a university setting. But the teenage years in particular, they are so important for defining our sense of identity. And we know in the teenage years, teenagers go through this whole process of what psychologists call individuating. So they're starting to form their own individual identity as separate from their parents, as separate from their family. They move more towards peer influence. We also know that the teen years are the age bracket across our lifespan where you have the greatest risk of mental health struggles. And so for me, this is such an important time to provide young people with that positive anchor. It's not a cure-all. It won't necessarily cure anxiety or depression, but it contributes, again, what we call in psychology, it's a protective factor. So it helps a young person get that internal anchor of something good about themselves. And so what you see in the cards that you just flashed up is we've moved away from stars and we've moved away from cartoons, and I've chosen very largely photographs of teens and kids with some images. So I think prudence, for example, is an image and forgiveness is an image, but a lot of the others, if you scroll down, are photographs that are showing that strength in action. So that, you know, a teenager and a kind of older child gets a sense of what does this look like in action and how can I utilize more of it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can use them in some quite similar ways, can't you? Although you're working with quite different audience with that age gap, age difference. Some of the ideas, the exercises are very similar.
I think there are many parallels. So you take story time and you change that to, say, a history lesson, and have as the students are learning about, for example, in this example, we've got Cleopatra and Caesar as the student in the history lesson, as you're teaching them about, you know, that time point in history, these famous historic leaders, that again, it adds that extra level, like it would for a story time with the younger kids. It adds that extra level of saying, well, as we're learning about these, let's get onto the Deckhive and how you guys tell me, like, you know, what are the character strengths that you see in Cleopatra? What are the character strengths you see in Caesar? Let's have a discussion about that. And what are some of the similar strengths they both had? They both had leadership. And what are some of the different strengths they had? So it's really makes sort of, it like gives a dimension to a history lesson, English literature class, art, the study, the history and study of art. So again, you could pull out certain artists and then have a conversation around, well, what were their character strengths that allowed them to, you know, that allowed them to create this sort of beautiful piece of art that's lasted the test of time. Scientists, what was it about Newton? You know, what was it about Einstein? What were their character strengths that Marie Curie, that, you know, allowed them to discover something about the world and the way that works that no one else could figure it out. So it really, it just, in all of those types of humanities subjects, it's kind of the parallel to the story time that we talked about earlier. So instead of reading a storybook, you're reading an English literature novel, or you're talking about people in history or people in art, or something to do with humanities, like the civil rights movement, Black Lives Matter movement. You know, like, what character strengths do we need to support, participate, be a part of this? There's so many ways you can use it.
Yeah, and one of the things I like about those examples is it makes those kind of figures from history or the role models that we might otherwise see as kind of beyond our ability to reach the kind of things they've done. It makes them more human, doesn't it? It makes us able to connect with them because, well, I've got some of those strengths that person has.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
strengths are this real sort of like what I call a social equalizer. So yeah, you look at these, you know, you could look at everyday famous sports heroes and sort of, and then realize, oh, well, they had persistence, I've got persistence. They had leadership, I've got leadership. And so all of a sudden, you know, there's not such a distance. There's a little bit more of that sort of social equalizing effect. And I've certainly seen that just within the classroom itself, when you get students to, if you were to use Deckhive and get students to sort of put up what they think their top strengths are. And then, you know, so I'm putting up that my top strength is, say, hope, and I've put my little post-it note saying Lee. And at the same time, 2 or 3 other people in the class have chosen hope. And all of a sudden I get to see, oh, we're not as different as I thought we were, because actually, you know, like we've got these sort of artificial social categories, but we both have hope.
Yeah. And also you kind of realize the value of the diversity that is there, don't you? Because you realize kind of just how dull it would be if everybody had the same strengths, and so you appreciate that difference even more, I think.
Yes, and I mean, you can, as teachers, you can use it to pair people together or put teams, like that the teacher who messaged me the other day and said, I deliberately put the more studious student with the student who gets distracted. And you can create student project teams and say, well, we need someone with zest, we need someone with perspective, we need someone with love of learning. So like, who do I have, and how can I kind of create the most optimal team based on the strengths that I know are happening in my students? And I think a lot of teachers do that intuitively, but what the strengths cards do is it takes something, it's like a social x-ray. So it takes something that's invisible that you sort of have a gut feeling for, and it makes it more visible so that you can do it a little bit more intentionally, a little bit more systematically.
And then you can apply it for an individual as well at a key time for them, can't you? Sort of maybe more in a coaching kind of context when you're trying to get them to think how they can use their strengths, so their strengths in action. So how would you do that?
Well, yeah, so I mean, you can do this as a class or you could do it individually. And so basically the idea behind strengths in action is what are the strengths that you would need for a particular scenario? Maybe it's getting your first part-time job. Maybe it's preparing for exams. Maybe it's having going for your driver's license, or, you know, going to your first kind of big party where there'll be lots of people, whatever it happens to be. And having that conversation with the young person. So what are the strengths do you need for exam preparation? Getting them to pull on, because again, you know, every child, every student knows, well, I need to study hard, but what does that actually look like? And how can you make it concrete by drawing on some strengths that you have? So having this very sort of fruitful conversation where they're calling on, well, they pull out self-regulation. You say, well, that's a good one. That's interesting. What do you mean by self-regulation? Why would you need it? Why does that help you prepare? And how can you operationalize that? What does that look like? Well, it looks like when I first get home, instead of getting onto Snapchat, I have to like set my books up and get my laptop ready. And what else does it look like? Well, it looks like when I, you know, feeling really tired and I want to just go and watch a YouTube, I'll just do 5 more minutes of study. So it's just a really, really concrete, and it's strength-based. So it's a generative conversation. It's not, you can do this as a parent, you can do this as a coach, you can do this as a psychologist, as a teacher. It's not sort of telling them what they should do. They're generating their own solutions, which, you know, as you know, Martin, that's kind of the essence of coaching and positive psychology.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Well, thank you for sharing some of those examples of how you and others can use these kind of tools. That's fantastic. We have just a few minutes left, so if there are any questions, then feel free to add them into the chat. And while you're thinking of a killer question to put into the chat, let me just quickly tell you, for those who don't already know a bit about Deckhive, as you've already been able to see, it's a simple tool to be able to use cards in a digital form. So whether you're working remotely, as Lea was describing, or face-to-face, actually, it means you have a range of resources available to use quickly and easily. So the 2 decks we've looked at today that Lea's created are just 2 of many that we have in a growing library of different decks that can be used in different capacities, either with children or with adults in many different ways. And you can also create your own card decks too. So if you're feeling creative and want to create something a bit different, then that's always an option. And if you're on one of our paid plans, subscription plans, then you'll have access to every deck of cards that's in the library. So we hope you'll find ways to use it and play with it. And it's still very new, so any feedback is gratefully received. Thank you, Abby, for your comment about the lovely cards. And any questions, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask in the old-fashioned way. But we have just a couple of minutes left, and there's a lot we've covered. Was there anything else you wanted to say, Lea, that we haven't covered?
Well, you know, I just thanks for having me. I really love Deckhive. I've gone through and used some of the other tools in more sort of adult contexts. I think it's a fantastic tool. I really hope that it kind of spreads widely, and particularly, you know, the younger cards. I think that these are just so helpful in a coaching environment, a school environment, orchestra, sports coach, theatre group. These are just, I really hope these cards get out to a lot of different adults who are working with young people.
Yeah, thank you. No, and thank you for taking the time to talk us through kind of your story and how you've seen these kind of tools being used. That's really great. So I see lots of lovely comments coming through, which is fab. People feeling inspired and motivated. So that's good. I haven't seen any questions. There's lots of nice comments. So how much do they cost is a question. So with Deckhive, if you're on one of our paid subscriptions, then you get access to all the decks. There's no additional cost for the content. But if people wanted to buy the physical version of these cards, Lea, can they do that on your website? And
yeah, just go to my website. There's a shop on the website. So
brilliant. And you ship internationally?
We do.
Excellent. Where will people find you if they wanted to kind of keep up to date with what you're up to?
I do have a website, as I mentioned. So it's Lea Waters, and Lea is spelled Lea. So think of tea, Lea and tea. LeaWaters.com is my website, where you can find out a lot of information. As I said, there's a shop there, but also just follow me on social media. I put a lot of stuff out around strength-based parenting and positive psychology and strength-based approaches. And so that's at Prof. Lea Waters. And that's Insta, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter.
Fabulous. And have you got another book on the way? Did I hear a while ago?
I told you that it would take me 1 year to write a book, and it took me 2.5. I started, and then COVID hit, and it's just I've had to sort of shelve it for a little while with 2 kids learning from home, and just my focus has got to be getting my family through this global pandemic and sort of still keeping afloat with my work. So I'm looking forward to picking it up. Yes, there will be another book, but it's not in the immediate horizon.
Okay, so we'll keep our eyes peeled in the months and years to come.
I will let you know.
Excellent. Well, yeah, thanks again. And if you found this session helpful, then do share with other people. So the recording will be on YouTube in the next 24 hours. And if you would like to learn more about some of the other decks in our library, then we have other Deckhive Introduces webinars with the other creators of different decks. So feel free to go and have a look at those. But thanks ever so much, Lea. It's been lovely talking to you at the start of our day, the end of yours. And we'll look forward to keeping up with you and using your cards in our work going forward. So thank you.
Thanks, Martin. It's been a lovely conversation.